the introduction to the populist publics, it will be reported by Lady Queen J. Arisgado. For the politics of anxiety, it will be reported by Miss Rochine P. Lucas. And lastly, for the politics of hope, it will be reported by Miss Shira May Dahuluran. Politics of anxiety, politics of hope, penal populism, and Duterte'S rise to power by Nicole Corato. This article interrogates such depictions by examining the logics that underpin Duterte'S strong public support. Nicole argued that part of Duterte'S appeal hinges on penal populism, built on two political logics that reinforce each other, the politics of anxiety and the politics of hope. The article examines the articulations of these logics among Duterte supporters based on ethnographic fieldwork in disaster-affected communities where Duterte enjoyed decisive victories. And for the introduction, the Trump of the East, Duterte Harry, the Punisher. These are some of the more colorful names the new Philippine president has earned from the press. He is a colorful guy, said U.S. President Barack Obama. Rodrigo Duterte's unconventional political style, demonstrated by the profanity-laced tirades whose targets range from the President of the United States to Pope Francis, has led to the creation of one of the most notorious demagogues of the international press. He is the crude yet shrewd politician, the local mayor who fanned the flames of public discontent and became president. However, his supporters are equally intriguing. As the president's catalog of gaffes grows longer, his level of public support remains solid, manifested by a 91% trust rating during his first week in office. A political economy perspective suggests that Duterte's popularity comes from a frustrated middle class that has been excluded from the Philippines' economic gains in the past 6 years. Duterte's politics of I will holds the promise of swifter delivery of services that are much needed in urban centers with crumbling public infrastructure. Others have taken a less charitable view and warn against the emergence of a fascist movement. A cursory look at online forums can lead one to think that Duterte supporters are blind followers whose moralities have been compromised. They are the personalities who call for killing sprees, scream bias at journalists, threaten rape and murder, while running the gamut of misogynistic comments. Duterte'S, as they are pejoratively called, are pathologized as political retards, pinning their hopes on a messianic leader. This article aims to critically interrogate these depictions of Duterte supporters by examining the logics that drive public support towards a controversial president. This argument is based on a 2-year research project among disaster-affected communities in Tacloban City, Philippines. She argued against the depiction of Duterte supporters during the campaign as a fanatical devotees and instead suggests that such support is a product of constant negotiation between the politics of anxiety and the politics of hope. While the former gains currency from the vocabulary of fear, crisis, and danger, the latter is animated by enactments of democratic agency among citizens who have been in the margins of politics for a long time. These logics are in tension but also mutually reinforce each other. The politics of anxiety constricts the space of political discourse by invoking the tough language of war against drugs and criminality. It fuels what sociologists of defiance calls penal populism, a political style that builds on collective sentiments of fear and demands for punitive politics. She argued that fear and anxiety are not the only driving forces for penal populism. Part of this is the logic of hopes, which broadens the scope of what electoral politics can achieve through methods that vastly depart from the machine politics that been characteristic of Philippine elections. She reflects on the normative implications of these findings and offers conjectures on the future of the Philippine public sphere. Who laughs at a rape joke? The Populist Appeal. A controversial speech in the Amaronto Sports Complex in Quezon City was a turning point for Duterte's candidacy. In this packed stadium, Duterte recalled the story of a prison siege in Davao City 27 years earlier, which ended in a bloodbath. Duterte was a mayor of Davao City at that time. In his usual rambling speech, he narrated the moment he saw the corpse of a 36-year-old Australian missionary named Jacqueline Hamil. During the siege, Hamil was raped, used as human shield, and brutally murdered, with her throat slit by one of the inmates. What went through my head was they raped her, Duterte said, that everyone had lined up to rape her. I got angry. That she was raped? Yes, that too. But it was that she was so beautiful. The mayor should have been first. What a waste. A remark so controversial could have been a fatal mistake for a candidate who had just topped the polls. But the electorate was undeterred. Duterte maintained his 11-point lead over independent candidate Grace Poe. The rape joke, together with Duterte's slew of remarks about criminals being legitimate targets of assassination, drew the ire of human rights advocates but did little to discredit his popularity. The concept of populism can help make sense of Duterte's appeal to over 16 million Filipinos who voted him into office. The precise definition of populism continues to be a point of contention in political studies. For some, populism is an ideology, be it a thin one that articulates people's resentment against the ruling classes that have monopolized power, property, breeding, and culture. For others, populism has no ideological core and is better defined by its social base. It refers to those who are increasingly frustrated with their declining status in society, rendering them vulnerable to irrational protest ideologies, which can range from fascism and racism and nationalism, among other things. While populism's relationship to ideology remains contentious, there is a broad consensus among political theorists about the logic underpinning populism, which is the construction of an antagonism between the people and the dangerous other. Such dichotomization in the political makes it possible to compare politicians who promote left-wing politics, as in the case of Kirchner in Argentina, have suggested there are varieties of populism, with some distinguishing the people from corrupt elites, while in some cases populists pillory immigrants and refugees of undermining the West's way of life. In Duterte's case, the populist dichotomy is one between virtuous citizens versus hardened criminals, the scum of society who, for Duterte, are beyond redemption. For Benjamin Moffat, the coarsening of political discourse is part of the populist appeal for the use of slang, swearing, and political incorrectness. The colorful language Obama referred to when describing Duterte are manifestation of disregard for established ways of doing politics. This makes the comparison between Duterte and U.S. President Donald Trump plausible, although to a limited extent. Both leaders invoke their narrative of crisis, which legitimizes their unconventional methods of political campaigning. However, to pathologize populist publics is to gloss over the dynamic characteristics of populism, such as the way in which the people is constructed, negotiated, and redefined. After all, populist claims to representation are a two-way street. The represented play a role in choosing representatives, and representatives choose their constituents in the sense of portraying them or in framing them in particular. The empirical task is to critically characterize populist publics in their relationship to the leader making populist claims and draw from normative theory to reflect on these trends, implications to democratic life. Populist publics. What then do we know about populist publics in the Philippines? Frederick Schaffer's ethnographic work among slum communities is a productive starting point. Schaffer observed that the poor communities are often disparaged for their short-sightedness and poor political discernment. They elect immoral leaders such as Joseph Estrada. They sell their votes during elections. They deliver warm bodies in political gatherings in exchange for 500 pesos. EDSA 3, a popular demonstration that protested Estrada's ouster from presidency, is often depicted as an inferior case of political mobilization. The masses that composed EDSA 3 have been dismissed as hakot, or transported. Crowd paid off to destabilize Gloria Arroyo's newly formed regime backed by a coalition of civil society groups, the church and business community. Estrada supporters have been described as rock-throwing, wailing, pipe-wielding goons, as polite company's worst nightmare. They may be victims of the Philippine apartheid, but their presence in EDSA signals no more than a personality cult that Estrada fostered throughout his political career. Schaeffer's work provides a counterpoint to such portrait of what I refer to as populist publics. He makes a distinction between the class definitions of what good politics ought to look like, while the privileged segments of society consider transparent and accountable governance as central to democratic practice. Impoverished communities view consideration and kindness as Schaeffer refers to this as class politics of dignity, the kind that shuns callousness and insult characteristic of politicians who only remember their constituencies at election time, while loyalty is bestowed to those who paid attention and offered a helping hand. Walden Bello's analysis of Duterte'S is consistent with this interpretation, where he identifies class resentment against the rich as impetus for mobilization, to say that they were simply manipulated by cynical politicians. Bello argued is to express a half-truth and to do the masses a great injustice. Duterte'S populist publics value the respect accorded to them by leaders like Estrada and place importance on being able to identify with politicians who make claims on their behalf. The one-time presidential front-runner Jejomar Binay built his political career on a similar logic. Before Binay's popularity was tarnished by a series of corruption scandals leading up to the 2016 presidential race, he developed a reputation of cultivating empathetic relationships with his constituents. Glenda Gloria's account of Binay's routine as mayor of Makati illustrates how the political of dignity operates in practice. Binay began his day early, jogging along the streets of Makati's poor districts and stopping by caranderias to break bread with jeepney drivers and street workers, and ended each day with a visit to every funeral site in town. While some interpreted these activities as enactments of patronage and personalistic politics, they were also manifestation of the politics of dignity, where the mayor considers it his personal responsibility to be in communion with this constituency. To be sure, Schaeffer rejects that dichotomy of choosing between clean but exclusionary and dirty but inclusive electoral politics. Ideally, democratic practice should be both clean and inclusive. But what his work exposes is the moral calculus of impoverished communities in conferring support to populists like Estrada as well as Binay, who are clearly not blameless, but nevertheless commanded the loyalty of a colony of smelly, boisterous, and angry people. Populist publics are not simply manipulated and disparate citizenry. Instead, they hinge on citizens' moral assessments, which decide whether to bestow or withhold support to politicians that have granted them recognition and esteem. Could the same logic be extended to the supporters of Rodrigo Duterte? The answer, as the subsequent section suggests, is a partial yes. Duterte supporters also reject the moral calculus perpetuated by the Aquino regime, which makes a distinction between the decente or decent and the vulgar, the clean and corrupt. What they bring to the public sphere is a renegotiation of the narrative of contemporary politics by naming new enemies and bringing new nationalities into the political conversation, while Estrada and Binay's type of populism is embedded in the politics of dignity. She argued that Duterte populist publics hinged on the politics of anxiety and politics of hope. Unlike Estrada and Binay's case, however, Duterte's populist publics are not class-based. His popularity cuts across classes, generations, gender, and geography. Duterte's populism, at least as far as the electoral campaign goes, is anchored on a different articulation of antagonism. The character of this antagonism is unpacked in the rest of this article.
Politics of anxiety. The 2016 presidential race did not begin as a campaign defined by crisis. It started as a three-way race among candidates who promised to extend the benefits of the Philippines' phenomenal economic growth to the poor and middle class. Campaign issues included broadening the coverage of the conditional cash transfer programs and income tax reform. The scope of antagonism was limited to demonizing candidates either for corruption scandals, citizenship issues, or incompetence. Duterte's entry to the political center stage changed the tenor of political conversation. So, a latecomer to the presidential race, Duterte placed the language of crisis in the foreground, depicting the republic as a nation on the brink of disaster and pointing to illegal drugs as the culprit. So, while Poe and Biner invoked the politics of personal dignity to distinguish themselves from the callous Aquino regime, it was Duterte's dystopian narrative that shifted the discussion towards a more urgent solution. Drugs, crime, and corruption can be eliminated. All of this comes with a price, and that price can be liberal rights. He would close down Congress if it threatened to impeach him. He would declare martial law if the Supreme Court interfered. His reign would be bloody and many would die, but his way is the only way to salvation. The populist narrative gained traction. Low pay and illegal drugs emerged as the top issues that voters want their preferred presidential candidates to solve. It was a departure from polls that listed inflation, jobs, and health as the top concerns among Filipinos. A few hours after voting centers closed, Duterte's opponents began conceding the race.
Their children's vulnerability to illegal drugs is a cause of concern because it could cost them their homes and put all of their hard work to waste. This anxiety is not overtly articulated in interviews but alluded to in conversations, such as when one mother said her only wish for her son is to stay in school and not do bad things. Only when prompted about what she considers to be bad things did droga come up in the conversation. Nicole offered these observations to illustrate how drug problem was articulated in everyday conversations before Duterte placed this issue as the center of national politics. The issue of illegal drugs was present by latent, they were acknowledged for having precise negative consequences for the community, but they never really focus of political conversation. Drug users were menaces who disrupt social relations, but it seemed that the dangers they posed were not central enough to warrant the sustained attention of the state. Instead, solutions to these issues were privatized. It was a problem resolved among neighbors, sometimes the local parish, sometimes NGOs, and sometimes the barangay captain. The recurring problem itself was never solved with finality. It is within this context that Duterte's penal populism gained traction. Duterte's anti-drug crusade recognized the public's latent anxiety and politicized a normalized issue. The populist logic of painting a dangerous other gained resonance among a public that already recognized the dangerous other, but did not have the confidence to name and shame the enemy out of fear of obligation to maintain community cohesion. Penal populism draws its discursive power from its capacity to attribute blame to both offenders and the political establishment that perpetuate shared anxieties. So, the part of the populist public support for aggressive rhetoric is the promise of justice that comes within it. The deficiencies of the justice system was further exposed in November 2014 when news broke about the lavish lifestyle of drug syndicates in the new beloved prison in Manila. National television broadcast pictures of a person with cells converted to air-conditioned rooms comparable to high-end hotels with a jacuzzi, private gyms, a recording studio, and its very own drug laboratory. For many, it was not an overstatement to say that the system was beyond repair. The politicization of crime and justice is often used as a vote-winning playground for politicians because they are powerful triggers for more indignation among communities. A strong leader evoking a sense of control resonated to communities who wished to reclaim stability in otherwise fragile contexts. So the politics of anxiety was, to a certain extent, a productive political discourse in the sense that it gave a voice and visibility to otherwise latent issues of social menace caused by illegal drugs. While some critics raised issues about human rights and due process, these issues, as far as the respondents of Nicole were considered, were secondary to the more pressing dangers they face every day.
Politics of hope. Fear is not the only sentiment driving penal populism. Together with the politics of anxiety comes the politics of hope. Dr. Nicole Curato used the term politics of hope for two reasons. First, the populism public's political action is oriented towards the future, investing what little resources they have to give voice not only to their fears but also their aspirations. In this sense, hope broadens citizens' time's horizon, viewing the future as something that is within the realm of their control rather than something that is left solely in the hands of elites. Second, hope captures the campaign's positive orientation. In popular media, the Duterte supporters are often caricatured as angry citizens resentful of the political establishment. However, equally as resonant as the resentment that goes with the penal populism as a reclaimed sense of democratic agency. It overcomes sentiments of abandonment for populism, broadens the space for political action. It portrays Duterte supporters as active participants in the campaign who can critically negotiate and reinterpret Duterte's pronouncements. The politics of hope enlivens democratic agency in various ways. First, disaster-affected communities practice democratic agency by performing reciprocity. "We've always been in the receiving end of help," said a driver whose truck is covered with pictures of Duterte's face. "But now we are in the position to help Duterte in the campaign. That makes me feel good." In a number of establishments in downtown Tacloban is an orange and white banner that reads, "It's our turn to help him, Rodi Duterte for President from victims of Typhoon Yolanda, Haiyan." In the memory of typhoon survivors is Duterte's quick response in the aftermath of Haiyan, sending Davos world-class rapid response team to help in relief operation. The story goes that Duterte arrived with no fanfare, unlike most politicians who come here, have their pictures taken, upload the photos in the Facebook, and then leave. This observation is widely shared among the respondents of Nicole Curato. Second, taking part in Duterte's campaign allows communities to reclaim their esteem as citizens who can take charge of their political destiny. Elections in the Philippines are often defined by machine politics where local bosses deliver votes through vote buying and intimidation. Even as Duterte start gaining grounds in the polls, major political parties claim that electoral machinery will ultimately define the outcomes of the elections. The populist public that Duterte inspired repudiate such a system, while Denbello 2016 described it as an electoral insurgency where a resentful public rejected electoral politics as usual. However, this must be read with caution. The Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism reported that Duterte's campaign was bankrolled by 13 large donors, which challenges the narrative that Duterte's campaign was run on a shoestring budget. While acknowledging the role of big business in founding Duterte's campaign, it's still worth recognizing the citizen-led political action that disrupts traditional campaign practices. Populist publics challenge money politics through modest ways of funding sorties and campaign paraphernalia. Local entrepreneurs mobilize their network to provide minivans, sound systems, truck ads, banners, and catering for campaign rallies. Overseas Filipino workers also played a role in democratizing funding sources for Duterte's campaigns. Third, democratic agency is manifest in citizens' construction of their collective aspiration. The politics of hope hinges on Duterte's promise that uses the language of urgency, while the politics of fear gains currency from the immediate need for punitive measures to quell criminality. The politics of hope opens up the spaces for citizens to visualize better conditions within their lifetime. However, to characterize the politics of hope is not to romanticize the fragmented yet overwhelming public support that propelled Duterte to the presidency. Duterte's campaign is far from blameless. Local politicians have quickly jumped ship to support Duterte, evidenced by sample ballots enclosed with cash for vote buying that placed Duterte's name in the field for president. The vibrancy of campaigns offline does not absolve the violent and sometimes untruthful commentary of Duterte's supporters online. Populist public's political gestures may appear modest, but when contextualized in the history of electoral politics in the Philippines, are not insignificant. The politics of hope enlivens citizens' political efficacy and esteem, something that classic patronage or machine politics does not necessarily deliver. This story, at least as far as this limited case study is concerned, warrants recognition in contemporary politics studies.
In a conclusion, this article argues that underpinning Duterte's penal populism are seemingly opposing, yet mutually reinforcing, logics of the politics of fear and the politics of hope. While the politics of fear exposes citizens' latent anxieties, the politics of hope foregrounds the role of democratic agency esteem and collective aspirations. I hope that by understanding these two logics that support Duterte's rise to power, I have characterized how populism is a negotiated relationship between the populist and his publics, a relationship that runs much deeper than one-way manipulation and demagoguery. Populism, as the previous sections demonstrate, gives voice to pre-existing frustrations as well as life to new possibilities for conducting electoral policies. Support for populist leader is a product of moral calculations the public makes, given their social status and broader political context. To this extent, populism can come modest legacies for democratic practice, especially when it disturbs the electoral system that is partial to money and political machinery. However, making this argument does not mean dismissing the view of populism as a pathology of democracy. Indeed, penal populism also creates a legacy of exclusion and divisiveness in liberal democracies. Although penal populism does give a voice to citizens' frustrations, it also silences the perspective of the dangerous other, for they are considered enemies that should be eradicated. For example, this case study does not include the views of the families of suspected drug dealers who have been gunned down in Tacloban. The punitive foundations of the politics of fear limits the public's imagination for measured and systematic response to the drug problem. Instead, it promotes spectacular short-term solutions to complex problems at the expense of human rights.